Hello and welcome to the latest Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutchin, political editor of the Daily Record, joined this week by John Ferguson, who is the editor of the Sunday Mail, and of course Douglas Dickey of the Scottish Daily Express. So we're going to kick off with a bit of analysis of two polls for the Holyrood election this week. There was the Norstat poll in the Sunday Times at the weekend, which was mildly encouraging for Labour, and it showed that Anas Sarwar's party was in a clear second place over Reform, although still miles behind the SNP. And I think there was a feeling within the party that they would be able to frame the election as a two-horse race between themselves and the SNP. However, there's an Ipsos poll today, which is frankly a disaster for Labour and very good news for John Swinney's party. I'll just go through some of the headline numbers. So it shows the SNP on 39% of the constituency vote, with Labour and Reform trailing on 15% each. I think the Tories are on 11%, Lib Dems and Greens on 10% respectively. In terms of the Holyrood regional lists, the SNP on 29%, ahead of the Greens and Reform on 16%, and then Labour trailing on 15%. And then there was also a seat projection, which puts the SNP on 63, too short of a majority. The Greens in second place on 17, Reform on 15, and Labour on 14, which, if that materialised on polling day, would be their worst ever Holyrood election result in the history of devolution. So, John, just when you think Scottish Labour might have turned the corner, the Ipsos poll comes in and they're back to square one.
Yeah, I mean, it's we don't really know what to think about this. Which one of these polls is obviously wrong, or maybe both of them. But I guess the takeaway of it is that no matter which one is wrong or by how much, the SNP are going to win this election, and really the fight here is for second place. It's hard to imagine for me that the Greens are going to get enough votes to actually become the official opposition. But I mean, who knows? It looks like support for Reform has hemorrhaged over the last couple of months. Labour just don't seem to be really coming up with anything particularly eye-catching to change the game. And then you have the Greens, who have this really quite stridently left-wing policy platform that there is a certain amount of the population in Scotland who are just always going to be very attracted to that. So I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see, isn't it, which of those polls was more accurate. But on the other hand, it's of limited interest for anyone whose their principal concern is who's going to win this election.
I mean, Doug, what are your thoughts? I mean, it just shows that, regardless of what the polling is, the SNP are miles in front.
Yeah, I mean, I was saying to John off air there, it's like the exact opposite of the SPFL title race, where we have three teams within 3 points each other. And in the Holyrood election, the SNP are 15 points ahead with 6 games to go. And I think their only worry now is that they don't do something incredibly bad in the last 4 weeks to kind of lose that support. I will say, I think John Swinney's had a really rotten week, to be honest. I think he looks a bit spiky right now. I think he looks a bit uncomfortable with a lot of the Jordan London stuff that's, coming out. His obsession with energy, I don't really think's hitting home. And I was interested, these polls are obviously snapshots, but I think the field work for the Ipsos Mori one actually was predominantly done before the field work for the Norstat one, even though the Norstat one came out first. So that one probably gives a more up-to-date snapshot of what's happening. I feel like Ipsos as well, they were 6, they inflated the SNP vote before the general election by 6%. So let's just wait and see what happens. I think the general momentum is that Labour are improving a bit. I think this is an outlier. I think Reform are starting to look a bit ragdolled, to be honest. And the Greens as well. I mean, their vote share in every poll just seems to be all over the place, so you're not entirely sure what you're going to get from them. But I think it's all a bit of a damp squib because
Do you
John
feel like people
Swinney's
are
going to be
switched on yet to the election?
no, because I think people just think, well, what's the point? The SNP are going to win. I think even SNP supporters are coming out and they're voting for them, or they're going to vote for them without any real love or passion. It's very much, let's just stick with what we know, or we might get an independence referendum. We support independence. We might as well go for the SNP. I don't think any party is really offering very much, to be honest. I think it's been a really uninspired campaign. I know it's still early days. I think it's going to be, it's not going to be a majority, but it's going to be a loveless victory for John Swinney. I don't think, he's maybe respected, but I don't think he has the same sort of fanatical devotion that Alex Salmond or Nicola Sturgeon had. And the other party leaders as well, much the same. Some of them, you ask your average punt on the street, they probably don't even know who they are. So it's been a bit of a. I mean, right now it seems to be everyone else's message, other than Labour, is stop the SNP getting a majority, or we can send a dozen MSPs to Holyrood to make a difference. No one other than Labour are saying we can beat the SNP, and yet that claim looks increasingly delusional, as we get nearer Poland.
I think one of the problems seems to be that, really, if you were to ask someone on the street, how will your life change if Labour were to win this, Conservatives were to win this, even Reform to some extent, given that their sort of central policy is really something that is not devolved, immigrate, they're not going to do anything about immigration if they get in. I think people would struggle to really tell you how their life would be different no matter who won this election. And so that makes it a kind of battle of, so who do you think would be the more competent, who would manage things a little bit better than the other person? And I guess that it's a very poor indictment on all the opposition parties that they don't seem to be able to convince the public that they would manage Scotland better than the party that have been trying to do it for the last 20 years with arguably terrible results, ferries, the crisis in the NHS, all the rest of it.
And yet the vast majority of the country clearly want change in government. That's the other thing. They clearly, because SNP are only polling in the 30s. So
I
people
feel
do
like
want
the
change.
SNP are in this position now where they're so far ahead, they probably feel like they don't need to come up with bold, ambitious policies. Like there's stuff on energy this week in terms of the response to the crisis in the Middle East. It was all calls for Westminster to do things. There was no creative use of Holyrood's powers or anything that an incoming Scottish government would do. It was just comfort zone politics of let's demand something from Westminster. I feel like they're so far ahead that I'm not saying Swinney is complacent, but I don't feel like he's being tested.
I thought the energy stuff was interesting from the point of view that it did sound like Swinney returning to what was the SNP's sort of one of their biggest selling points was that Scotland's oil, we've got this huge energy resource, we can be a rich country if we exploit it. The issue is that they don't really have any power to, grant you drilling licenses or anything like that. So
They've also spent a decade arguing against.
yeah, exactly. But it did feel interesting to see Swinney sort of returning to what you think is like sensible ground for the SNP to be going. We support renewables. We should be doing everything we can in that direction. But as long as we are using hydrocarbons, we've got this opportunity to be energy self-sufficient and give the UK and Scotland energy security. And it would be mad to turn your back on it. That feels kind of sensible to me for the SNP to take that line. And for 10 years, they've not been. So I thought it was quite interesting to hear the change of direction there, but I'm not convinced that it's going to change any minds necessarily how people are going to vote. And also interesting there will be if we end up with a hung parliament where the SNP have to look at going back into some kind of coalition, either officially or unofficially with the Greens. Then how long will that newfound commitment to North Sea oil and gas survive?
Well, that's his biggest problem. His biggest problem is man-made, is he has set up himself that their aim is to win a majority, which is obviously really difficult. So, some ways, it doesn't matter if he wins 64 seats, he'll have failed in what he set out to do, and it will be presented as a failure by his critics. And it will be, because that's been his aim. His aim is to win a majority, which always felt like a really strange plan. But I mean, if that's John Swinney's biggest problem this week, then I think he'll be quite happy.
Yeah, but at least if you're in the SNP, you're thinking all the polls show, or most of the polls show, a majority is within their grasp. They're on 62, 63. At least the ambition that they've set for themselves feels like it's doable. Whereas for the other parties, success is way in the horizon.
Well, but success is relative. I think right now, success for the Tories would be hanging on to 50% of their MSPs. But that is the reality. I think Reform are another party who are maybe, set themselves up for a relative failure, because a few months ago we were talking about them, in the mid-20s in MSPs and the official opposition. Now it looks like they're in a scrap for second, third place. I noticed, I done a wee analysis thing on the last 5 polls this week, and basically the 3 main parties are all going to lose seats, and the 3 smaller parties are all going to gain seats. And I think that tells you something about the state, not just of Scottish politics, but British politics. But ultimately here, SNP support is so strong around one issue that it's not going to actually matter to the overall result. It's really just the numbers at the end of the day.
It's the only thing really that would make this an interesting election is going to be the day after, and it looks unlikely, but if the SNP were to get that majority, that would be a very significant thing in terms of calls for a second referendum and all the rest of it. Interestingly, you don't really even get the feeling that there's that much enthusiasm for that to happen within the SNP, in a way that they're kind of like, oh my God, I hope we don't need to deal with that eventuality.
Do you feel like support for reform is slipping a bit in light of their disastrous start to the campaign, with candidates lost, and they lost their spin doctor, and the homophobic joke, and other rows? Do you feel like people are having a look at reform and saying, nah, no thanks?
So it feels like that's kind of happening across the whole of the UK, doesn't it? That you've got this, well, some might say charismatic leader in Nigel Farage, but the problem is that you literally go one step below that and there's a shower of complete bampots. And people can see that quite plainly now when you've got an actual election campaign. They've had to release a list of candidates, and how many of them was it? 5, 6 had to go within the first week.
Yeah, certainly a few for different reasons. I mean, there was one chap who's disqualified as a director, a couple just quit on their own. But yeah, so it was a range of different reasons, but the sort of common thread was perception of chaos.
Yeah, like it just feels like there's not enough to them, doesn't it? That it feels like Malcolm Offord's main thing would be to try to appeal to Conservative voters with tax giveaways, and I don't think there's enough votes in that, is there, to really make a difference in Scotland.
Do you feel like they made a mistake in choosing Offord rather than Councillor Thomas Kerr?
I think what Offord represents is a safer pair of hands. But I think we discussed last week on Reform's core issue, he doesn't look comfortable. He doesn't look comfortable being anti-immigration, because we know he's not, or he's not been in the past.
He doesn't even look that comfortable being anti-independence.
He's very. I think Malcolm Offord is a really capable guy, but he's having to deal with, as we've discussed, when you kind of go below that level, it's maybe not the greatest quality Other parties have had that issue in the past with maybe being able to professionalise. Reform are still relatively young. I quite like Thomas Kerr. I think he's quite a good communicator. I think he speaks from the heart. But I think Malcolm Offord is having been there, seen it, done it, probably was still the kind of best man for the job. But I'm not sure. I just think I've always felt Reform would roll back slightly. I don't think the Reform vote's going to collapse. I think they're going to win 15-16% of the vote, and they're going to end up with certainly more than a dozen MSPs, which when you
I think
consider,
their vote is quite
yeah,
solid. There's part
which
of it that
which
is soft, but
yeah,
overall, I think
which when you I think people forget that Reform are coming in from a standing start. For 0 MSPs, they won what 1% of the list vote in 2021. They didn't perform particularly well here in the general election. I mean, for them to do what they're doing is actually quite impressive. But again, victim of that early success, they've gone for expecting, maybe we could win 30 MSPs here.
Could you imagine Malcolm Offord spending 5 years in the Scottish Parliament and sort of
he was a
leading
successful businessman.
the,
He made a lot of money. Is he really going to want to be at Holyrood for 5 years?
sitting in that debating chamber rather than swanning around the Mediterranean in a yacht?
I mean, I know I'd rather be
whatever
doing at Holyrood, obviously. Getting to the cut and thrust of Scottish politics.
Feels to me like he quite a big ego. He's genuinely going into this thinking I could become First Minister here if I play my cards right, and it's not going to happen. Is he really going to be interested in sitting around shouting at John Swinney for 5 years?
Seems like the story of the election so far is that the SNP have a huge core vote. No one is eating into it, and it's a race for second place.
And yet the SNP are still going to lose hundreds of thousands of votes. It's quite a depressing situation where you've got a party who openly admit they can't really make the country any better in the current constitutional situation, and yet others who say that they can make the country better within the current constitutional framework aren't even able to make any inroads. Obviously, Labour have suffered badly from Keir Starmer's performance down south, at Westminster. Although I think he's in a better few weeks, Starmer. Maybe that might rub off. These polls were taken last month, incidentally. It's quite a long time, and a week's a long time in politics. It's been over a week since the fieldwork on the Nordstat one finished. So, and like I say, I don't think it's been a good week for the SNP on certain issues. So, I think a more interesting thing will be see, whether that Ipsos poll is an outlier from a Labour point of view, or whether those kind of early signs of a Labour comeback are actually held up in future polls. But they're never going to get to, we're never going to be in a position where they're going to be challenging for the league title here, are they?
I mean, I go back to like the general election 2024, which is widely regarded as the worst SNP result in a generation, and yet they won 30%. So a bad day, really bad day for the SNP is 30%. That's their standing start. They've got a huge core vote.
I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, in a way that they're, after 20 years, pretty much they're still so popular in Scotland. I think it kind of highlights the fact that this attitude that success, or no matter who's in power at Westminster, I think that the line is going to be no second independence referendum, not now, not ever. And it kind of feels like they're becoming a victim of that people then can vote for the SNP without having to worry that they're ever going to actually have to face the SNP getting to do the one thing that is their primary purpose. But what they will do is fight with Westminster on every issue for a bit more resource for Scotland. And people seem to think, well, even if they're not very good at managing that resource, at least they're fighting for a bit more. I guess the other takeaway is that it does feel like you win elections in Scotland from the sort of soft on independence centre left. That's seems to be what the continued success of the SNP and the Greens' undeniable rise in popularity seems to be based on approaching it from that sort of standpoint. So it'll be interesting, if this is a bit of a disaster for Labour, if we get a change of leader after the election, I wonder what kind of Labour Party will emerge.
Same question for you both. Let's imagine they do get that outright majority. See if there was an independence referendum in 2028, how do you think it would go?
Let's get the crystal ball out. I think a lot would depend on the framing of it. I've been a bit of a critic of the independence question for a start that was used in 2014. Every piece of evidence that we've seen since suggests that if you're asking people if they want to remain in the UK, they would vote overwhelmingly to remain in the UK. But, should Scotland be an independent country? It's quite an emotive question. There's probably a lot of people that think we should be, but maybe it's best not to be. My own personal feeling is 2028, I still think it would be a Union victory, but probably a lot closer than it was in 2014, which, let's not forget, wasn't the kind of close run thing the SNP like to make it out to be.
Felt close in the end.
It felt close, but it wasn't. And I think it'd be something similar again. But one of my big issues with the whole thing is that we treat these referendums as if they're elections that we can just change every 5 years or whatever. And I think the idea of breaking up the UK based on 50% plus one, I think is really, really foolish. But, I would say that, I suppose.
John, how do you think it would go?
I mean, I don't think that you can deny what successive polls seem to be showing on this polls over the last few years, which are that support for independence is running at about 50%, but quite often a little bit more than that. If you look at where we started the last referendum, it was the sort of mid-30s. It's like you say, when you've got, if the question is, should Scotland be an independent country, you could expect a sort of very positively framed campaign that will gain support rather than lose it as a campaign goes on. You have to think that what these successive polls showing Scotland's support for independence is hovering maybe just above 50%, despite the fact the SNP actually don't really talk about it very much or really even do anything to pursue it. I don't know when the last time we heard about, people trying to get a Section 30 order from Westminster to have a referendum. You just don't hear anyone really talking about this stuff, about what the strategy is. You don't even hear it, and yet there seems to be this settled will of possibly a majority of the population that they would go for independence given the choice. I guess one of the things that might tell you is that polls at the time of the last referendum showed quite clearly that older people didn't want it, but that as you down to younger generations, they were much more pro-independence. Now, one school of thought would be as people get older, they become a bit more cautious, they get mortgages, they don't want to take a risk. But maybe that's not true. Maybe the fact is that you've got a younger generation in Scotland that it's their settled opinion that they would, if it came to it, they would vote for independence.
And yet there was one poll that actually showed 16 to 24-year-olds would back the Union. So it's not quite as, I don't think it's quite as simple as that. It is the general point. But I think what's interesting you say, John, is that the SNP don't talk about it. Maybe that's why support for independence is rising, because the reason they're not talking about it is because they still don't have the answers to pensions, to currencies, to borders.
I mean, all these things,
don't have these
all
answers.
These things would go up. I guess the biggest argument that there would be a very good chance that Scotland would become independent if there was another referendum is that they're not getting to have one. That would kind of suggest to you, and with good reason, that that the UK government looks at it and thinks we're not risking that. It's way too close.
I take your point, though, that if there was a second referendum, I don't think it would be a rerun of the first referendum in the sense that the power was temporarily devolved to Holyrood, and Holyrood pretty much had full control. I think you'd see Westminster demanding much more of a say.
Mhm.
And
How
it'd
the
be like
question
a
is
UK
framed.
wide,
Yep.
a UK stroke Scottish run referendum, and there'd be much more of a fight over the question, i.e., is it yes or no or leave remain? So, David Cameron pretty much said to the Scottish Parliament, you organise your own referendum. I don't think that would happen this time.
No, I don't think so. And I think there would be other frameworks about what would constitute a victory, to make a constitutional change like
I think that
I think it would be difficult to see. I think
that would be a
it would
lot
seem
better if there was a
to
50% plus one, and
yeah.
then that is considered to be staying in the union. I just think that would be
Albeit,
Would it
generational
not be?
difference.
Would it not be? Well, on an 80% turnout.
I think
I,
you've got 50% means one side's won, no matter what
And then we
the
break up a
turnout is.
300-year-old
But I'd say,
union.
but I do
that's what it
think
was
that
for Brexit.
it would be a disaster.
Well, does it? That doesn't make it. Just because we've done it in the past doesn't make it right.
I think what Brexit shows you is that a slim majority would be if it were to happen, it would be much better either way that it happened in another referendum with one side winning 60 plus, wouldn't it? So that you could really say this thing's over now.
Yeah, it's all about academic until it actually happens. So let's just focus on the final story that we're going to look at this week. Kate Nevins is a Scottish Green candidate on one of the regional lists. She has attracted media coverage over the last few days over her belief that prisons should be abolished. I think she's described herself as an abolitionist. Doug, I mean, where do you start with this? Where would the rapists and murderers go if there were no prisons?
I've absolutely no idea. Rehabilitation centres or
Home curfew,
yeah,
poetry
or
lessons.
I don't know, nature reserves or something to kind of play, frolic in the wildlife. I mean, this is the issue with the Greens. Every time it looks like they're making headway and they come out with policies that you might not necessarily agree with, but you can see why they're popular, and you can see why they're going down that route. You scratch below the surface, and there's always that wee bit of crazy there. We're talking about a party, remember, who didn't think Hamas should be a terrorist organisation. I mean, it's just bonkers, and I think to me it shows that maybe Ross Greer and Gillian Mackay aren't and can put control of their own party. I know they like to play up how it's a members-led organisation, but when when you add in the kind of candidate row in the northeast as well, that's kind of erupting for them. They don't actually particularly look like a party that are in control of themselves. Although, as the poll suggested today, that might not matter. But it's absolutely nonsense. And yet she is going to be at Holyrood. I don't think there's any doubt, regardless of the poll today, even in the poll on Sunday. We're going to have someone at Holyrood who advocates for the abolition of prisons, and that is petrifying.
I mean, let's face it, prisons are not going to be abolished.
No.
It's not even a minority view, but to hear someone say that was pretty shocking. To be fair to Ross Greer, the co-leader, he did distance himself from that opinion. But when that sort of thing gets a bit of traction, when people write about it and they see that there is a Green candidate who believes in this sort of thing, it's not a welcome development for a party that is doing extremely well in the polls.
People are going to be writing about it and bringing it up every single day between now and the election, aren't they? These are the people that want to get rid of prisons.
All these TV debates, you could see the Green leaders getting hammered on this.
Yeah. I think like privately, Ross Greer will be pretty raging about this. It's going to follow him around for the rest of the election campaign.
Yeah, he wants to focus on free bus travel,
listen,
things like that. Not rapists not going to prison.
Yeah, I mean, last week, for example, the Sunday Mail, we were putting together a sort of election spread, and we made the lead story in that spread the Greens pledged to slap an extra tax on private schools, because it was just clearly the most interesting story that any of the parties had for the weekend. I think that there's quite a lot of things that they come up with that there's there is support out there in the public for them, but this one was so sort of outlandish that you did find, like, you did initially. I kind of thought, well, there must be a catch here. There must be some small print. They can't actually be saying they would abolish all prisons. This must be a nuanced argument in some way, but it wasn't.
She then doubled down after the party had put out clarification.
Yeah,
so.
it's good. I mean, I know, like, the Greens traditionally are the party who, if you look at the history of it, there's people who will be saying things that seem outlandish, and then in another 5-10 years they become more mainstream views. For example, on the environment, that is things that the Greens would have been banging on about 20 years ago, are things that all parties now kind of agree with and coalesce around. But it's difficult to see this one catching on, isn't it?
I'm just going to. It's interesting you were both talking about Ross Greer there. I'm wondering if you can settle a Scottish Daily Express debate for us live on air. Even though the Greens have co-leaders, I think it's widely accepted that there's always a dominant partner in that. I think Patrick Harvey was seen as a kind of senior to Lorna Slater. Do you think there's a dominant party between Ross Greer and Gillian Mackay, one who's going to become the kind of face of the Greens more than the other?
Well, I think that elections are always good judges of these things. I think this is our first election. I think we have to see how this goes. I mean, both are young leaders. I think they get on with each other. They do tend to carve things up when it comes to dealing with the media. So I'm not sure. I think that both have got a profile in their own right, and it'll be interesting to see how they adapt to the campaign.
I mean, my theory is that Gillian Mackay's a much better operator than Ross Greer, and I think she'll emerge as the kind of dominant one. But some of the other guys on the SDE desk disagreed with me.
Oh, there we go. All right. Well, look, I think that wraps it up. Thanks very much to John and to Doug for joining me. And thanks also to Darryl from the Records video team who produced this episode. You can listen to Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.